Hello, everyone. Welcome to your museum moment with me, Ellie Gettinger. I'm the education director at Jewish Museum Milwaukee, and I am delighted to be sharing this moment with you. For those of you who know me, I tend to be someone who can go down research rabbit holes. And when I get into one of these research rabbit holes, I find that I just want to know more and more and more. And so you guys today are going to be part of one of my more recent museum rabbit holes. And it all started with this very well-worn book. This is a book that I've had since I was a kid. I picked it up when I was home recently and read it to my children and was so enraptured by the wordplay in this book, by the art in the book, and by all of this that I kind of had this momentary remembrance of the author, Ellen Raskin. This is not Ellen Raskin's best-known book. This is her first novel for kids. It's called The Mysterious Disappearance of Noel. And some of the hallmarks of Ellen Raskin's books come out in this one. It's filled with wordplay. There are puzzles galore, and the level of humor is not always directed, I think, at the age of the kid who's reading it. And yet you can fully enjoy this as a child or as an adult. So in reading this book, I'm going back, and there's this one thing that stuck out to me is that when they're describing the soup business, it's at the center of the center of the fortune. In case in this book, they set the jingle to On Wisconsin, which takes me back to this thing in thinking about Ellen Raskin, and I'm reminded of the fact that she grew up in Milwaukee. So Ellen Raskin grew up in Milwaukee. And I have no idea, except for a cultural sense of if she's Jewish or not. So this started my first deep dive into Ellen Raskin to discover whether she was Jewish or not. And in going there, I ended up finding a lot of great information about Ellen Raskin. Oh dear. I found a lot of great information about Ellen Raskin, but I've got to switch out my PowerPoint slides. So in thinking about this, so she was born in Milwaukee, and her father actually was working in Milwaukee. He had grown up in Sheboygan and was the only child of his parents to survive into adulthood. So he ends up being an only child. On her mother's side, her mother had grown up in Milwaukee, and her mother's side was chock full of children. In fact, she was one of 9. And by the time Ellen was born, she had 16 first cousins. 16. And she describes family gatherings by Lake Michigan in which 50 people would be present for these picnics, and holiday feasts in which there would be 30 people there. And even the weekly poker game, there would be 20 adults, 20 family members present week by week by week. And so you're like, wow, that's so many people, so many things going on in this family. And that was kind of part of the crucible of Ellen growing up, is just being part of this large and exciting family, from what I can tell. That it was a lot of creative juices were flowing from this family, and a lot of enthusiasm, excitement, and things like that. One thing she describes early on, now that I have my PowerPoint ready to go for y'all, is and this is actually a picture of her and her sister Lila with her grandfather, and it's actually a step-grandfather. This is a person who she models the character from her book, Figs and Phantoms, Uncle Florence, after. He supposedly always wore garters on his arms. And his name was Grandpa Sam Hirsch. He had been a Russian immigrant and was actually quite well-to-do. And it was a contractor, had done well, but during the Depression went back and gave to all of his tenants, all the people who had mortgages, and he held those mortgages for some reason or another. He gave them back their mortgages so that they wouldn't lose their houses during the Depression. And so she really loved this kindly person. She felt that he was such a great model for her life, and he becomes a model for one of her books. Her family was never so well-to-do. They moved a lot as children. She moved 5 or 6 times before the age of 10. She was nearsighted. She was advanced. She was pushed up to the next grade when she was in 3rd grade. So she was always one of the smallest children in her class. And I think a lot of those ideas about being small, about spectacles, about moving around, about not quite fitting in and not finding your place, being a loner, are all themes that emerge in the books that I've encountered from Ellen Raskin. Going back to that giant family, she talks about her this is another beautiful picture of her and her sister. And this is on those family poker games. She says, the kids were not allowed in those games. So my sister, whose real name is Lila Ruth, and my cousin Sonny Boy, and I provided the entertainment that followed coffee, cake, and coffee. Sonny Boy wasn't as smart as my sister. So she confined the drama to 3 characters each. But this was one of her kind of origin stories of writing and character and making characters and creating interesting and memorable characters, I think really emerged in this time period. This is a census page, and this is one of the many houses, apartments in which they lived. This is on Center. It's, I believe it's 50th and Center. And it's not, it was never in great shape. And it always was a, kind of crowded, I wouldn't say tenement style, but, this was a very small confined apartment. One of her picture books is called 4 Rooms in an Apartment, and it's really based on the places that she lived in Milwaukee. Her dad actually was a pharmacist at Mount Sinai Hospital, but on that he had all sorts of side gigs as well. And her dad is really the inspiration for Dr. Wexler in the Westing game. So we'll get to there in a bit. This is pictures of Ellen Raskin from the literary staff club at Washington High School, where she attended. She graduated at the age of 16 in 1945, and she goes on to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she initially starts majoring in journalism. After a year of majoring in journalism there, her sense was she was going to go and follow stories and be an adventurer on some level. She goes to an exhibit at the Chicago Art Institute, and it was an abstract expressionist exhibit. It was not hugely well received, but it was life-changing for her. And she goes back and she changes her major at UW-Madison to fine art. And when she talks about this later in life, she has this sense that her early career, her early writing, her early schooling was all very much that she was an excellent student because she was excellent at following rules and filling in the lines and doing what people asked of her. And when she graduates, she does this kind of revolutionary thing. She moves to New York. And she starts working for a commercial artist there and learns the whole business because it's a very small company. At the same time, she buys herself a printing press and starts working through block printing in a number of different capacities. She leaves this commercial art endeavor and pushes herself out into the world of illustration. And she illustrates and does the covers of over 1,000 books. The most notable of these is the original first edition of A Wrinkle in Time is an Ellen Raskin cover, which I think is kind of amazing. I know for many of us book nerds that the idea of Ellen Raskin and Madeleine L'Engle being in the same room and having some sort of conversation, even though that probably didn't happen, that's not usually the way that illustrators and authors work together, is kind of amazing. And you can see this is a really bold vision of what A Wrinkle in Time is said. These are two of her other books, but she did 1,000 of these. And at some point after doing 1,000 different book covers, she started thinking about what she would want to say. And in 1966, she published her first picture book. The first one she published it was Nothing Ever Happens on My Block. And one of the things that is really clear in reading Ellen Raskin is she loves wordplay and she loves visual play as well. And you can see that in both of these. You've got Nothing Ever Happens on My Block with this incredible text and typesetting. And behind this little boy, I believe his name is Chester, is sitting on the stoop and on the curb. And behind him, there is a fireman and a thief, and he's not noticing either of them. On the flip side, in Spectacles, the little girl there is is seeing the world through her myopic bad vision and is seeing things wrong, and it is all corrected with her spectacles. So you get this kind of visual and wordplay through what she accomplishes. She becomes fairly accomplished as a picture book writer, and a publisher comes to her and says, an editor comes and says, have you ever considered writing novels? And she goes, well, I'm a picture book writer, and I'm working with Athenaeum. They're my publisher. And this other person from Dutton says, no, I think you should write children's books, novels. I think you should start by focusing on your growing up in the Depression in Milwaukee. And the book that came out of that is The Mysterious Disappearance of Leon Ivy Noel, which she says has very little to do with her Depression existence, although it does come out at the beginning that people are so poor that they only have tomatoes and potatoes to make their Thanksgiving feast. But it is such a fun read, and there are all of these kinds of Easter eggs hidden throughout the book. When she writes novels, she says, and before you ask, I never know the ending. If I do know the ending by the second draft, I don't want to write the book. The ending is my reward for doing that book. So maybe on the fourth draft, when I type out the ending, I love it. I always have happy endings too, because I write children's books and I do them specifically for children. And I never make fun of people, and I'm very sensitive to that because I was made fun of as a child by other children, or perhaps because I love my characters too much. And there is this real sense of love for the people she's talking about in her books. Her most famous book is, of course, The Westing Game. And The Westing Game came out of a number of different sources. It's one of my favorite stories that I've encountered as I've been studying this. One is that she grew up in Milwaukee and she wanted to explore labor history at the time of the bicentennial. So she's going to craft this book around three things. One, the bicentennial, which is 1976 when she's writing, and she thinks, what if we have this kind of patriotic vision? It's going to be a cool kind of backdrop for my book. So if you've read The Westing Game, America the Beautiful figures in prominently to it. Two, it was the death of Howard Hughes, who left this mysterious will. And, all of these kinds of, juices started getting her going about saying, oh, how could I make that into this? And the third thing was she thought about the labor history of the Kohler Corporation. And she envisioned a magnate similar to that of Kohler. And that is where Sam Westing came from. Strangely, she thought this was going to be a very pro-labor history sort of mystery when she started. And then as she started writing, it became increasingly supportive of capitalism. The one thing, and I put actually, this is from UW-Madison has the manuscript of The Westing Game. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about Ellen Raskin's work is because she was a artist and a typesetter and someone who is so connected to that part of the craft, when she wrote her novels, she was very concerned with how they looked. So at a point in which most authors bow out and say, I don't need to see this anymore, she would look at each of the proofs of each of the pages and designate white space and make sure there was enough white space and add breaks to pages and change up the section headings because she felt that was important. Other things that were important to her as a writer was that a book for an 11-year-old not be more than 200 pages, and that the margins be about the size of an 11-year-old's thumb so that they could hold it without covering any words. And finally, there should be lots of breaks on a page because people get tired when they read and they need to have space to really get into a story. She says about her books, to me, writing for a reading child does not mean preaching or teaching. I leave that for the more qualified. It does not mean prescriptive formula. If I had the need for a formula, I would write for adults. It does not mean catering to arbitrary reading levels or age groups. My readers have one thing in common. They are young enough or curious enough to read slowly, and the slower, the better for my books. Ellen Raskin died in 1984. She died of a connective tissue disorder. She was 56 years old. And I think one of the things that I really discovered in reading this is in researching is just how much that passion for Ellen Raskin continues today. And one of the things, and one of the reasons I think she's not so well known is by design. She really thought the biggest thing she could give the reader is the book itself, and that she, as the writer, could be totally, it was unimportant to the process. And so while I am thrilled to reintroduce her as a person to many generations of people who've enjoyed her books, I'm even more kind of in awe of her ability to write and separate herself from the culture of saying me, 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 me. So thank you for sharing this very special museum moment to me, with me. Give a shout out about any other Ellen Raskin books you've read. I can tell you I just finished Phantoms and Figs. It was a fascinating read. I'm about to read The Tattooed Potato. So if anybody wants to go on a Ellen Raskin journey, I'm here for it. On Thursday, my colleague Molly will be sharing the stories of Charlotte Ray, Nate Lubotsky, and Gene Wilder, Nate Silberman, and we are going to explore some more fame and fortune from Milwaukee. Thanks very much for sharing this moment with me.